The Ubera Empire, having received power from the Spirit of Light, Milaneo lit the sun, and the caster Frid summoned the Spirit of Darkness and created night. While the former gave life vitality, the Freed gave peace. When Milaneo illuminated the world with warm light, Freed cast a shadow over the world in which to hide from the light and the heat. This is how the world, the Ubera Empire, was created by their hands. The current imperial family of Milaneo, as well as the Archdukes Freed noble and beautiful, capable of controlling spirits, are the only ones in this empire. A little girl read the book and said it wasn't even funny, and her name is Dorothea Milaneo. She's a princess of the Ubera Empire. At this point, a brother started running towards the protagonist, but Dorothea told him to shut up. Ray asked where she was going. He asked if he was making too much noise. He told his sister not to be angry because he would be quieter. He always follows her around and bothers her. Dorothea thought she didn't know what to do with him. Her brother's name is Raymond Milaner, Crown Prince of the Ubera Empire, and her stupid brother. The protagonist thought that he was the rightful crown prince who had once died at her hands. This is the protagonist's second life, a last chance given to a tyrant, and she's determined not to make the same mistakes. That's the purpose of her life. The onion that Dorothea retrieved from her past life. There is good and evil, and there she was evil. Killed the heir, usurped power, became empress, got rid of those who opposed her, gave power and wealth to those who kneeled before her. But she ruined it all in the end. The man she loved hated her and chose death. The people to whom she gave power with her help overthrew her. Nastia's people nicknamed her Tyrant. Their anger set fire to her palace and killed her. And the protagonist accepted death with dignity. Afterwards, Dorothea woke up in the body of a child. The protagonist thought that maybe this was a lesson for her, a lesson worth living, a chance to turn back the clock and correct her life of anger and regret. The protagonist thought Ray's murder and usurpation of power. The birth of Dorothea Milaner foreshadowed all these misfortunes. Dorothea decided she shouldn't kill him again, and what was not done, she would not hate, she would endure. Ray asked the main character what she was doing again. He asked if she was reading boring books again. He said she must be a genius. He said she's so little, tiny, and cute. He asked how she could be so smart too. The main character asked her brother to back off, but he called her a cutie. Dorothea didn't like Ray very much. At this point, the protagonist told her brother that he should have learned Ubera history, but Ray said he wasn't that smart. He asked his sister if she wasn't bored with all this studying. But the protagonist thought that her brother had a flower garden in his head because he had more than she did. After all, he was the crown prince. This is the moment Ray asked Dorothea to go out and play. The protagonist told herself to be calm and told her brother she wasn't going. She said if he wanted to go, he could go himself. But Ray said he wanted to play with her. At this point, the maid came up to the boy and told him that he couldn't interrupt the princess's lessons like this. At that moment, the maid saw what the protagonist was reading and wondered if she had already started studying the history of their empire. The maid looked in the book and saw that it spoke of a spirit of light. At that moment, she asked Nastia if she knew that it was said that the soul stone brought by the first emperor Tiresias had been lost. But Dorothea told the maid she was wrong. She said the stone of light disappeared in the time of the Koreas. The protagonist said there were hundreds of years difference between them. The maid was surprised and said she probably was. She was surprised and said that the main character remembered the entire genealogical tree of the Milaners. She asked how she could be so clever. At this point, Dorothea realized that she should have pretended not to know. At that moment, the maid said His Majesty must know about it. But at that moment, the protagonist asked the maid not to tell it to him. The emperor, Kernan the Milanese. In other words, the protagonist's father. For Nastia, the very word father sounded strange and unfamiliar, a strange word that she could translate. But she couldn't understand or feel it. Blood kinship meant absolutely nothing to her, because she didn't inherit the traits of the Milaners. Alice, Nastia's mother and empress, died shortly after her birth. To the main character, born after the death of his beloved wife, Kernan was indifferent. Previously, Dorothea tried with all her might to attract his attention. She purposely fell in front of him so he would notice, bragging about her intelligence. The main character was trying to be better than Ray in everything, but her father didn't notice her until the very end. It was different with Ray. Even without doing anything, he received gifts from the Kernan and they ate together. Ray could laugh, asking a lot of Kernanu's questions. Dorothea didn't understand why he cared more about Ray, silly, playing in the mud. Not her, who was trying desperately. Dorothea didn't realize if it was because she was unwanted. This made Dorothea hate her brother very much. She tortured him as much as she could. She felt she had to take what she didn't have. The further I went, the more my relationship with Artem looked like a vicious circle. Dorothea waited for love, but her life was far from it. It's like reaching for the moon, hoping to catch it. Nastia's love has always been unrequited and unavailable. So her anger and resentment gave birth to the seeds of evil in her soul. Envy, jealousy trampled others, robbed them of everything and devoured them mercilessly. All this is the time of the new tyrant, Dorothea Milaner. The protagonist wondered what it mattered now. Now she realized that it was pointless to shift her guilt onto others. She thought it was just her fault for being unlovable. The protagonist thought that now everything is different because she does not feel guilty before Artem. She thought it would be better to live without looking back at the shadows of the past. The maid thought His Majesty would be pleased to see the young mistress. Outside, the maid pointed ahead and suggested that Dorothea take a walk there today. The maid said it was for a change of heart. The protagonist realized that this was Alice's homeland, the garden that Karnan had built for his beloved wife who missed her homeland. The protagonist came here often in her past life. She thought it was a long time ago. But that's when the protagonist met her father. Dorothea couldn't believe she'd done something so stupid. She didn't realize if she was being rude or if she had made a mistake. Karnan asked who had entered Alice's garden. At this point, the protagonist realized that she was trying to live a good life. The maid explained that it was the main character. Karnan said it's crazy that she doesn't even know how to say hello. He asked if the protagonist was uneducated. Dorothea thought it was so, for she had no parents to teach her. The maid told His Majesty that was not so. She said that Dorothea was a very clever and capable girl. But Karnan said all he saw was a haughty little girl. The maid told Karnan that it was only a first impression. She said Dorothea was well-versed in royal etiquette. At this moment, the protagonist properly greeted His Highness. At this point, Karnan asked how old she was. The protagonist replied that she was turning 8 this year. The Duke asked what was so special about her. Dorothea said the maid was exaggerating and there was nothing wrong with her. The nanny said that Karnan could see for himself. She said that the protagonist is modest and intelligent compared to her peers. She said the protagonist knows all generations of the imperial family. At this point, Karnan asked if it was true that she knew the Melaner family tree. The main character said she knew. She said that since it was an imperial family, she thought it was her duty to know. She asked Karnan if he himself knew the royal line of the Milanese family. But Karnan asked if she was testing him. Dorothea said she thought he was trying to test her. She asked what good it would do her to read a family tree. At this point, Karnan asked if she was disgusted by the mere word emperor. The protagonist said she was trying to save him time. She asked if he hadn't been busy enough to come and see her since she was born. She asked why she should study the family tree just for his interest. The protagonist said she hoped he wouldn't waste his time on her. At that point, Karnan said the nanny was right. He said that then if Nastia needed anything, she should tell him. The protagonist didn't understand why he was saying that. She thought that as far as she could remember, Karnan had never said it to her. She didn't understand what was wrong with him. Dorothea thought that if she were her old self, she'd be very happy. And she's sorry to say it, but she doesn't want anything from him. But Dorothea couldn't help but respond. She said that then he made a wine of the highest grade and named it after her. The protagonist didn't realize whether to ask for something more useful in the future. At that moment, Karnan asked the nurse if she was sure she was teaching the child. He asked if at that age it was proper for her to speak of such things. The maid started to deny it and said that she had never spoken about alcohol in front of the princess. But at this point, the protagonist explained to Karnan that her nanny didn't teach her that. She said she read about it in the book Portrait of Babalua. The protagonist said that there is a scene where Babalua discusses the perfect taste of wine with her lover. Dorothea said that this is why she thought she would like to taste good wine. Karnan didn't realize whether this child had really read Babalua's portrait. He thought and told Dorothea that he would create a better wine and call it by her name as she wished. But he said that, however, if she ever made a mistake, he would punish her racing for lying. Karnan said so Dorothea recalled the entire genealogical tree to the imperial family. At this point, the protagonist thought that maybe her father had shown her how to be a tyrant. Karnan told the protagonist to start by listing the Melaner family ancestors. The protagonist thought she had decided to live the good life, so she needed to save the nanny's life. The nanny hoped to draw Karnan's attention to the protagonist, but he never came. The nanny said Dorothea was a poor child but said her father was the emperor. She said he must be very busy so he couldn't come. But the protagonist thought that Karnan was not that kind of man. The nanny always tried to support Dorothea in this way, and the protagonist was actually grateful to her for that. When Dorothea sees Karnan, she feels bad. In order to live a good life, one must avoid the factors that mar it. Dorothea thought that in the old days, she would have gone out of her way to prove herself better than Ray, and would have been punished more than once by Artem. The protagonist thought it was stupid. She realized that it was useless to hope to hurt you. Only now she realized it. Being good meant doing nothing. She thought that when you try to do something, you're bound to be hated. At that moment, Ray came to Nastia and asked if she was here. Nanny walked up to him and asked him what was wrong. Ray asked the nanny if his sister was here, but the main character started to run away and told the nanny not to tell her brother that she was here. After Ray realized Nastia wasn't here, he said he was going to show her how he dealt with the spirit of light. The protagonist didn't understand why he would show her this. She didn't understand if he wanted to make fun of her. The spirit of light is a blessing given only to the Melaner family. It's a long history. The power of the Melaner, capable of raising the sun, has weakened. Only a small flame remains. The protagonist thought it was just like her, a princess unable to control any spirit. The protagonist thought she didn't fit in with the family. That's another reason why Karnan doesn't like her. That's why the protagonist was so jealous that she went against the deity himself. It was this story that led Dorothea to a small success, the emergence of the little fireflies. The protagonist thought it was safe to say that she had gained the throne with a sword, and by coming to it she declared the end of the magical age and the beginning of the human age. But in the end, she lost, and was summoned by the Tyrant just a few years after she ascended the throne. The protagonist thought that perhaps fortitude and truth determine an heir's ability to rule an empire. Dorothea thought she had had a bad end, the punishments heaped upon her for her deed. But she raised that it didn't matter now. Ray asked the nanny if she really didn't know where his sister was. The nanny said that unfortunately she did. Ray said with a sad voice that he wanted to meet her friend. Dorothea heard this and started to walk away. She thought that this friend was rather of Ria's age, and thought it was crazy. She was going to leave the two of them alone and go to rest. Dorothea started to go round and thought that if she went this way, she could get round Ray's room without being seen by him. But at that moment, Dorothea ran into a guy. The unidentified guy said he was sorry. He asked if the protagonist had hurt herself. Dorothea thought it was ridiculous. She didn't understand why he was here. The man she loved most in her past life, whose greed ruined her. The man who hated her so much. Dorothea wondered how she could forget him. Her love, her breath, her eternity. The guy asked the main character if she was okay. He asked if she could get up. At that moment, the protagonist thought that she had never once forgotten him after returning. Theon said he was terribly sorry and asked if she was in a lot of pain. He said the main character's clothes got dirty. He said it was his fault and he was careless. After that, he handed Nastya a handkerchief. And Ray asked if she had sprained her ankle. He asked if she could get up or if he should call someone. At this point, the protagonist told the guy that she missed him, and Ray realized he hadn't heard anything wrong, but he didn't understand how she could know him. At that moment, Ray took the main character by the cheek and told her not to cry because her eyes would swell. The protagonist of this looked at the guys and thought that the one who had left her with a grudge was now around, alive and just as handsome. Dorothea realized it wasn't a dream. She did not know whether she could say that she had fulfilled her life's duty since he was alive. At that moment, Ray smiled and said that Dorothea was good. At that moment, the protagonist thought that maybe that's what she had come back for. But that's when Ray saw it all. He asked his sister if she had hurt herself. He asked what happened. But at that moment, he saw the protagonist in tears. Without listening to his sister, Ray lunged at Theon. He asked if the boy had made Dorothea cry. Unsure, and Ray said it could be. But at that moment, he lowered his head and said that he probably was. He said he was sorry. At this point, Ray started shouting at him and said he was very bad. He said he thought he was a good friend. Ray said that Dorothea had never cried like that, not even when she was little. He asked what he had done, and Ray wanted to explain himself. But at that moment, the protagonist interrupted him and stood up for him. She told her brother that she wasn't crying for Theon. She said she just had something in her eye. The protagonist said that she was in a lot of pain because of the speck. Ray asked if everything was okay now. Dorothea said it was all right. She thought that she had never imagined that there would be a moment when she would be grateful to Ray for what he had done. Ray said it was a big relief. He asked what was wrong with her knee. Dorothea said it was just a bruise and would go away soon. At this moment, Ray stood astonished because he couldn't believe that it was the princess who had covered for him. But he thought he'd never met her before. He didn't understand why she was crying. At this point, Ray turned to Theon and said he was sorry. He said he had misunderstood and apologized. But Ray laughed and told Ray he was right. He said that he had indeed behaved ignorantly. At that moment, Ray remembered that he was going to introduce them to each other. Then he introduced Theon to his sister, and Ray bowed to Dorothea and said that he had made a mistake when they first met. But the protagonist could not believe that the friend he wanted to introduce her to was Ray. After the protagonist introduced herself and Ray kissed her hand. At this point, it became clear to the protagonist that this was their new beginning. She thought their story had not yet been written. She wanted the guy to forget about her, cruelly craving his love, the sorrows of the past. Dorothea wondered if in this life she would have more love for him in her. Maybe then he wouldn't leave her. At that moment, the unknown girl told Theon that she had asked him to wait for her. She asked why he had gone alone. From the voice of the protagonist, she realized that this was Theon's first and last love, Julia de Leving. Ray was forced to marry the protagonist because of their family's arrangement and her stubbornness. Until his death, he loved only Julia. These two had been in a special relationship since childhood, but Nastya didn't have time to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. That's how he ended his life. Dorothea realized that she longed for Karnan's love but never got it. She longed for Theon's love and she suffered the same fate, a life without love. Ray was faithful to Julia even after his marriage to Dorothea. They exchanged dozens of letters behind her back, and the protagonist was waiting for him to start feeling something for her. The protagonist wondered if Julia might have disappeared from his life. At that moment, she realized that she was begging for her death when her loyal servant killed Julia. The main character was happy. She thought that Ray would be hers now, but he chose death and left her. He was reunited with Julia. The protagonist realized that he died because of her greed. She realized that her selfish love had ruined him. Dorothea didn't know if she could desire his love. She didn't know if her heart would be broken again. Ray was glad Julia was here, and Andy Ray told her that he had asked her to wait, but Julia said she was very bored. At that moment, Ray introduced Julia to Dorothea. He said that he and Theon had come from the Great Duchy of Phrygia. Dorothea greeted the girl briefly. She realized that in this life they were together again. Dorothea wondered what her expression was now. She thought it must have been dark thoughts. At that moment, the protagonist turned around and said that she was going to go to her room because she had something to do. Ray was surprised and asked if she would play with him, but the protagonist answered nothing and continued walking while her brother called out to her. Afterwards, Ray asked his friends what had happened to her, but they were puzzled themselves. Dorothea thought it was right. She killed the crown prince with her own hands. Her love chose her own family, and an innocent soul is executed at her mercy. Dorothea realized there was no room for her there. In the room, the maid asked Nastia if she didn't want to play with her friends, but the protagonist said she was tired. The maid said she couldn't help with that. She told the girl to have a good rest and she would wake her up for dinner. Dorothea was lying in bed crying and holding Theon's handkerchief. After a while, Dorothea sat reading a book. Simultaneously, Ray was running around the room and interfering with the protagonist. At this point, Dorothea closed the book and asked if he could stop running from side to side. But Ray said he was nervous. He said he's going to be Crown Prince today. The disgruntled protagonist agreed that Crown Prince of the Uber Empire is a really important title. Ray said that's why he's even more worried. He asked his sister if he looked like a prince. Dorothea looked at her brother and thought he looked like a puppy. She said he looked like a fool again today. Ray got upset and asked if it was true. The main character told him to do something about his face. At this point, Ray told his sister that he wished she was the crown princess, not him. He said Dorothea would pass the initiation ceremony without trepidation or fear. He thought she was smarter than him and generally brilliant. He said he was sure she'd make a good empress. But the main character said she had no connection to the spirit. But Ray said that's not true. He said she'd be able to call him out soon. He said he didn't know anyone as outstanding as her. The protagonist thought it was good to live in ignorance, and she's poisoned by what she knows. She thought her brother was just saying that because he didn't know anything. She thought that time would tell the weight of what he said. Ray asked his sister if she would say something encouraging to him, but the protagonist asked if she should. Ray said that if she backed him up, he was sure he could handle it. The main character said he just messed up the way he knows how. But Ray asked her not to talk like that and asked her to hug him just once, but the protagonist left him in a hurry, ignoring the request. The sealing ceremony represented the arrangements for the appointment of the official receiver and operator, and was a momentous occasion for the entire state. Dorothea looked around and realized that, come to think of it, she hadn't noticed it before, but the setting was rather modest. She thought that Karnan A had a smaller crown than she had thought, but the protagonist thought that maybe she was just being too extravagant. The protagonist thought that when she was smaller, even this sight turned out to be amazing. But Dorothea thought nothing had changed. At this moment, she looked at the scepter and remembered that it was originally supposed to have a lost spirit stone embedded in it. But at that moment, she wondered if they had found him. She remembered that they had found him shortly before her execution, but she couldn't remember exactly. But Dorothea realized it didn't matter. In any case, it had nothing to do with her. At that moment, Ray walked into the hall. Dorothea realized that this was just the beginning, and she really wanted her brother not to make any mistakes. At that moment, Ray noticed his sister's gaze and smiled at her. Dorothea was confused because she didn't understand why he looked so stupid again. She mentally told him to look straight ahead. She realized that he needed to stand straight and look straight ahead. At this point, Ray nodded and Dorothea thought he didn't do that. She didn't realize if he really was an idiot. She didn't understand why the spirits kept flying around her. She wanted her brother to do the right thing. At that moment, Dorothea thought that the next emperor was a fool. She thought she wouldn't have behaved like that. But when she caught herself thinking that, she realized she shouldn't think that. At least she hoped that the person who would ascend to the throne this time would write a new story. Karnan announced that they had shortened the ceremony to seal the crown prince. People said that Karnan had a very fine spirit considering that he was accompanying the crown prince. The protagonist thought that the surname Melaner was like a curse for her. At that moment, the two women looked at Dorothea and the first said that if you think about it, the princess was looking more and more like the late empress. The second woman said that she did. She said that Dorothea was just like the empress of her youth. These situations were happening more and more often. Karnan told the women they were talking rubbish. They apologized afterwards. Despite her father's refusal to give up on Nastia, she couldn't leave. She knew that everyone knew that Karnan and Ray were at the center of this story. And Dorothea is the shadow left on the wall by the candle. But she couldn't give it all up since she's a Milanese. Dorothea realized that if it were past her, she would come out into the light and show her worth, opening everyone's eyes to the shortcomings of their crown prince Ray. At that moment, Ray told the protagonist to go to them. Dorothea thought she didn't care about any of that now. She didn't see what was so funny about it. Dorothea just wanted it to be over soon. The protagonist thought that her brother was a fool because this was his place, and she was not worthy to stand beside him. She thought it was impossible to solve the problem just because he was here. She thought that if he wanted to help so much, he should have offered her something to eat. At that moment, Ray came over and asked Nastia if she was having fun. The main character did not understand why the guy was here, because she thought he would be with Julia. At that moment, Ray offered Dorothea a drink, because she hadn't had one for a long time. The protagonist was surprised because she didn't realize he was watching her, but she didn't realize what kind of drink he had given her. She even felt sorry to drink it. And Ray told Dorothea that Ray talked about her a lot. He said she was very smart. He said he heard that she could list all the generations of the ruling Melaner family, but Dorothea said it's a small matter. At this point, Ray said they could meet in the Episteme soon. Episteme is the best academy in the Empire, where the most talented and noble people study, a place where the children of the most famous families meet and make future connections. Most came from other royal families and states, graduated to Episteme. Despite the fact that Ray easily got into the academy, the protagonist was not supposed to outshine the crown prince, and so the road to Epithema was closed to her. One day in protest, the protagonist escapes from the palace to throw a stone at the academy. The stone broke a window and hit the head of the duke's eldest son, Armor, and Karnan's punishment locked Dorothea in the palace. From then on, her relationship with Artem died. The protagonist realized that she could not repeat her mistakes. She realized that enough time had passed since she had given up her past self. The protagonist told Theon that she would not go to the epitome, and Ray asked her why since she was a princess. At that moment, Ray realized something. Dorothea realized that he was quite intelligent, so he didn't continue. She was sure he understood, but the protagonist didn't want him to know everything. She thought she needed to change the subject. The protagonist wanted to discuss the weather, but that's when Julia came in and told Theon that His Highness was calling for him, and Ray apologized to the main character and said he had to go. But she said it couldn't be helped. She said they'd see each other later. Dorothea was left alone and wondered if she could now go to her room. The protagonist approached her father and said she had something to tell him. At that moment, the man who was standing next to Artem turned round and pushed Dorothea. This caused the drinking glass to topple over onto Dorothea. Karnan asked what was going on here. The man explained to him that he had not noticed the princess and said he was sorry. But at that moment, Karnan told the protagonist to quickly apologize. Ray tried to defend his sister and told his father that she was the one being harmed. But Dorothea just bowed to the man and said she was sorry. The protagonist realized that the interlocutor is Karnan, a Duke of Bronte, and he is a more important guest than the unassuming princess. Duke Bronte said it was his mistake. The protagonist didn't understand why it was so hard to apologize. More than once and more than twice, Karnan had made her do it, and she would still remain guilty, even though it was unfair, sad, and unjust. At this point, Karnan ordered Robert to take the princess to her room, as her clothes were soiled anyway. The protagonist decided that this is even good, because now she does not have to find excuses to leave. But when the protagonist turned around, she saw Theon with Julia. The protagonist realized that what they were seeing was a pathetic princess who had lost the remnants of her dignity. Dorothea became desperate and didn't want them to look at her. She didn't want to be looked at like that. The glass of juice was filled with red love, spilt with feeling, again defiling Dorothea. Such treatment by Karnan is in order. He makes her apologize by bowing her head, but Theon's gaze has shattered the protagonist to pieces. For the protagonist, it was even funny because she knew that Ray never loved her. But watching them with Julia was painful for her. The protagonist realized she had to let go, had to let Theon go as soon as possible. At that moment, Ray knocked on Nastia's room and asked if she was okay. He said he had come because he was worried about her. He asked if she would come out to him, but the protagonist shouted for him to leave her alone. She told him to go back to the others, but Ray refused and said he'd stay because she was here. He said the party was no fun at all. Ray suggested to his sister that we play together. Dorothea ran out to her brother and started shouting for him to clear his ears and listen to her carefully. She said it's not a case of leaving because it's boring. She said if he was the crown prince, he should act like one. She told him not to think about having fun, but to do what he had to do. Dorothea said he didn't need to worry about her. She asked just to be left alone. The main character grabbed her brother and said if he only knew. But at that moment, she was interrupted by Ray. He asked if she was okay. Ray said Ray and Julia were going to play PK together and he was the one who brought them. But at that moment, Dorothea let go of her brother and quickly closed herself in the room. The main character was questioning herself. She didn't know if things could get better. She didn't know when things went wrong. She didn't know what they thought of her. Dorothea thought she had to be better by all means. This is her path to redemption. From that day on, she did not get out of bed. She had a high fever and pain all over her body. Annie comforted Dorothea and told her she would soon be well. Dorothea realized that she had to hold on. Longer than anyone is all she can do. A few days later, Ray still hasn't come to visit the protagonist. Dorothea decided he didn't hate her for being so mean. Well, at this point, Dorothea noticed her brother peeking at her. Ray started to approach Dorothea and said he had brought a present, but the protagonist told him she didn't need it. But he said he was sure she'd like it. He brought Dorothea the first tomatoes he'd grown himself. He said he secretly dug some beds in the backyard. Ray asked if their color wasn't wonderful. He said he had also planted pumpkins and aubergines. He said that when they grew, she would be the first to see them. The protagonist did not realize that the crown prince, who had been officially admitted to the episteme, was wasting his time on this. Dorothea asked her brother if he was gardening instead of studying. Ray said he was studying in his spare time. The protagonist realized that unlike her, he was getting everything he wanted and spending his time playing games. He ended up in the crown prince's rightful place. Ray told his sister that he studies a lot in his spare time. At this point, he asked his sister if she was angry and then apologized, but said that last time she said she didn't like it, but they were going to play. Dorothea thought it had started again. At this point, she told her brother that it wouldn't make him a good emperor. She decided to live a peaceful life this time. She still doesn't want her brother to be emperor. The protagonist didn't realize if it was because she can't do anything about being a tyrant. Ray told his sister to try the tomatoes because they were good. He said he brought them as soon as they were ready. Rhea said that of course he would study hard at episteme and become a better big brother. Dorothea thought he was talking nonsense and he'd better take care of himself. At that moment, Ray asked his sister if she would like to go outside sometimes. He said it would be too stuffy for him to stay in the palace all the time. Dorothea thought she had never been outside the castle. Dorothea thought she didn't get into episteme and was so tired in her past life that she wasn't interested, but there was something she already knew. Ray told his sister that she'd never been outside. He said it was very stuffy to be inside these walls. He said that last time he went to the market, there was a lot of incredible things that had crossed half a continent. Ray said Dorothea would have had a lot of fun there. He said it was because she was smart. He was sure she would see a lot of new things. At that point, he asked if she would like to go with him, but the protagonist refused. Ray was upset and asked why, but Dorothea said it was simple. After that, he kept pestering the protagonist to go for a walk. Dorothea thought he'd calm down if she said no. After a while, the protagonist thought she couldn't go on like this any longer. Afterwards, she agreed to go for a walk with her brother, which pleased him very much. But she made it a condition that she would go alone. She said Ray could go with a nanny or security, but she wouldn't go with him. After a while, the nanny was helping Dorothea get ready. The protagonist asked the nanny if she really had to wear this. The nanny said yes, because she looks great in that outfit. Nanny said she would really like Dorothea to go in it. She said that she finally the day has come when this outfit will see the light of day and she is very happy. The nanny said she wouldn't hurry up until she changed her mind. After a while, the protagonist along with her nanny went outside. Dorothea watched and realized that there were a lot of people around. The nanny told the protagonist that the place was very crowded and asked her to hold her hand so she wouldn't get lost. Dorothea thought that she was not a child, but realized that she was now, of course, a child. In her previous life, she had never walked around holding hands with someone. At that moment, the nanny told Dorothea to look. She asked her if it was the first time she had seen it. Back then, suffering from the war, corpses lay everywhere. The protagonist remembers only the wind developing the smell of blood. Dorothea thought this is what an empire looks like without the tyrant. At this point, they approached the musicians performing in the square. Nanny asked Nastya if she wanted to go and see. The protagonist thought that people didn't even think about enjoying this world. Nastya is 9 years old. The bandits were discussing when they would kill the main character. One of them said they would do it when they got the money. He said they'd try something before then. Dorothea had never bared her sword since her return, and now this happened. 3 days earlier. The protagonist, along with her nanny, tried on outfits. The nanny asked Nastya if they could buy everything. After shopping, the maid told Dorothea that while she was here, she could go and buy her favorite books and come back. She said that if they went through that alley, they would see a bookshop. Nanny said they could also try the desserts later. She said it was a shortcut and there were fewer people. She said she couldn't wait to see the happy smile of the main character. But at that moment, the babysitter was attacked from behind by an unknown male. With one precise blow, he knocked the woman out. And after the main character was knocked out as well, Dorothea didn't care how early she died, but she didn't want to die at the hands of these scoundrels. The bandits were discussing something. The first said that it had been 3 days since he had sent the nanny for the money, and that he had not heard from her. But the other said that it would take time to collect the necessary amount of money and get to the designated place. The protagonist realized from the conversation that she had slept for 3 days. Now she understood why she had no energy at all. Dorothea realized that everything could have turned out well, except that Karnan might leave her here. Dorothea realized that he would probably throw her away as a pawn rather than give her the money, so she could not trust him. At this point, the protagonist started twitching and the bandits noticed it. The main character said she couldn't see anything. She thought it wasn't her style, but she had to play a fragile girl. Nastya's blindfold was removed and she asked the bandit who he was. The man told her he was there. Dorothea didn't realize that these were her kidnappers. She thought they looked like some kind of fools. She asked if the uncle was her new nanny. but the man told her he wasn't her nanny. Dorothea asked then he was a friend of her dad's. The man said it was right. The main character asked if she could call him Uncle Tutu. The man was embarrassed and said yes, but the protagonist thought she would definitely kill him. One of the bandits said Dorothea was very beautiful, like a doll. He said it could be because she was one of those. Dorothea remembered that there was a man who told her she was very beautiful every day. The main character didn't like the way she looked, but she didn't think she was that awful to others. At this point, she asked where they were. The man explained that it was his house. At this point, the main character asked Tutu what it was on his face. She said it looked really cool. The man said that a long time ago he had to fight alone against 17 men with his bare hands. But he said one of them sneakily pulled out a knife and attacked him, intending to cut out his heart. The man said he dodged, but the attacker was even faster and ran away. But the man said it was nothing and he chased him into the forest and met a bear. Dorothea thought he was just like the Romanov writers. Dorothea thought that thanks to the man she had a chance to look around. She realized that the situation was not so desperate. At this point, Dorothea told the man that she was hungry. Tutu told his friend that Dorothea was hungry. He offered to feed her because she was hungry enough. But the second bandit told the first that it was not his garden. Dorothea thought they were enjoying their dinner, imagining how much money they would get from her. She thought that even though it was disgusting, it had been a long time since she had eaten. At this point, the man sat the protagonist down at the table, but the second bandit asked him if he would finally wake up. He asked if he had come to play mother's daughter. Tutu said she was just a child. The protagonist didn't realize she hadn't eaten for 3 days. She thought it had been longer than that. At that moment, the second man stood up and approached Dorothea. He said that they had brought her here to kill her and the man was not her uncle. The protagonist asked, but why? But the man threw her against the wall and said that when he sees rich kids like her, his stomach twists and he can't help it. Tutu tried to tell his friend that it was horror too much, but he told him he was going to kill her. He asked if he wanted to die first. The protagonist realized that the second bandit treats people like a burden. At that moment, he noticed something under the table and became very frightened. At that moment, a scorpion ran out of there. The protagonist was surprised because she hadn't seen them on Lampsea Island. Both men were very scared of the scorpion and were afraid to catch it. The main character thought she was starving to death and they are very noisy. At this point, she asked the men if she would share bread or milk with her if she caught the scorpion. The second bandit asked if she would catch the scorpion. Dorothea got a little angry but said she needed 2 sticks. The bandits agreed to give her food if she caught the scorpion. After that, she was untied. On the table, Dorothea saw the gambling toss sticks and thought she had seen such a thing before. After that, she easily caught the scorpion. The bandits told her to get rid of it as soon as possible. But Dorothea said she didn't like the sight of blood, and her hands were very weak from hunger. But the bandit told her to throw it outside. He said if she got rid of it, they'd feed her. Dorothea asked if they would feed her for the next few days, and the bandits had to agree. Afterwards, Dorothea climbed the stairs outside. She realized why it was so dark in here. But when Dorothea went outside, she realized why she hadn't been found. An endless desert where no matter where you go, you don't know where you'll end up. Dorothea didn't even know which way the city was. She didn't know if anyone knew she was here. She realized there was nowhere to run and she didn't know what to hope for. Dorothea sat at the table and ate bread. She realized that the bandit had kept his promise, but she was sorry that the scorpions had not crawled in again. At that moment, a bandit came into the room and said it was because she was an islander. The bandits got scared and looked suspiciously at the protagonist. And afterwards, they left the room abruptly. Dorothea didn't understand who they were talking about. She thought that the man must have kept it a secret from the imperial family. She realized that if they wanted to live, they would never send her to the imperial family. The protagonist realized that, as expected, waiting for Karnan a madness. At that moment, Dorothea found a knife in the bag of one of the bandits. She stood by the door and overheard a conversation about killing her. The second blonde man said Dorothea was just a child, and they couldn't kill her. But the second said she was a princess, and if anyone survived and pointed them out, they were dead. The first bandit asked if he thought that when they found out that someone was involved in the kidnapping, he would be spared. Dorothea thought her fate was sealed. She thought she had no choice but to grab the knife. After that, a second thug came into the room and said they were in trouble. He couldn't find the main character who was standing behind him. At that moment, Dorothea lunged at the man. She realized that she had little chance against him and the only way to win. Afterwards, the protagonist slashed the man's back. Dorothea realized she was too weak and the cut was shallow. At that point, the man grabbed her by the neck. The protagonist cut his hand, but that just made the man more angry and he asked how dare she. Dorothea realized that she didn't have the strength to attack him. She thought that if she were just a little bit stronger. At this point, the man started shouting that he wanted to let her leave nicely. He told her not to move because she wouldn't be able to escape anyway. Dorothea didn't realize there was nothing she could do. After that, the protagonist kicked the man. She thought she couldn't beat Ray or get into epistemology. The protagonist didn't realize if it was because she didn't deserve Karnan A's attention. Dorothea did not realize that she could not win Theon's love because she had been betrayed by her faithful servant. The protagonist looked into the bandit's eyes and thought she was seeing that look again. She had seen it many times before the rebirth, a look like a monster in front of them. But Dorothea didn't understand why, because all she wanted to do was live. At this point, the protagonist asked to be left alone. She said she decided to live a good life. Afterwards, she made her way outside. Dorothea was exhausted but kept going. After a while in the night, she realized that it was already quite dark. She was afraid to fall asleep. The protagonist wondered if she could control the spirit of light. Would it be easier for her? Dorothea wondered if it had been Ray in her place, how quickly they would have come for him. The main character couldn't believe she was still thinking about it. She thought it was very funny. And afterwards, she fell to the sand unconscious. When the protagonist woke up, she realized she had passed out. She didn't know how long she had been lying there. I didn't know if she'd die like this. Dorothea thought she was going to meet her death, looking lonely at the night sky and thought it wasn't fair. But that's when she saw the light. The protagonist heard the sound of horses' hooves and realized that someone was coming. She started to get up thinking that God was very cruel. She thought she would finally die, but he brought her back to life again, even after killing so many people in the past. The main character couldn't believe she still wanted to live. Dorothea didn't know if they were bandits or Karnan's men, but afterwards she fell down again without strength. She thought about it again and again. Dorothea thought she was very funny. She wanted to believe that someone could love her. Anybody. After a while, the protagonist woke up on the bed. She couldn't understand what this place was, but at that moment she realized she was back. She realized it meant they were Imperial Knights, but she didn't know if it was a good sign. At that moment, the protagonist heard Karnan's voice. The maid told him that the names of the kidnappers were unknown. Karnan asked if the protagonist was the only one kidnapped. Dorothea thought he was here because of her kidnapping. She figured that whatever it was, he was her blood father. But at that moment, Karnan said that all this was annoying him. He said not to make another sound. He told the maid to find the leak and deal with it. He said that if anyone continued to spread rumors, they should punish them. The protagonist thought her greed made Karnan hate her, but now she doesn't fight Ray or touch him at all, and Karnan doesn't love her anyway. Dorothea thought she was being punished for being a tyrant. She thought that you had paid for what she had done in her past life. The protagonist convinced herself that there are such things. Otherwise, she would not stand for it. After a while, the butler told Dorothea that her body temperature had returned to normal and she was recovering, but he said she was still weak. At this point, the maid asked Nastya how she was feeling. The main character never saw the nanny again. She was eventually fired. The main character said she was fine. She thought it wasn't the nanny's fault. After all, she was a kind person and had always treated her well. Dorothea hoped Nanny was doing well. At this point, the butler said that whatever the case, the protagonist should rest in a quieter place. The maid asked if it was in a private hospital, but she said the princess should stay in the palace. The butler said that there was a palace in the Sarishan district that was suitable for recovery. When the princess heard this, she realized that meant she would be able to get out of the palace and be far away from Karnan, Rhea, Theon, and Julia, and away from human eyes, where she can regain her strength, so that no one would dare to offend again. The protagonist didn't know if she'd be stronger, if she'd become a tyrant again. After all, she'd been trying to avoid it for so long. But Dorothea thought that maybe she could protect someone if she used the right kind of power. She told the butler she wanted to go there, for her life to be prosperous, and she needed to gain power. The maid was surprised and asked about the princesses, how she took care of herself, but she said it was very stuffy in here. The maid was surprised and told the butler that Dorothea wasn't usually like this, but suddenly stiffened. At that moment, Ray entered the room along with the flowers. He came every day after Nastya returned. She didn't know if he was tired. At that moment, Ray asked what they were talking about. The maid explained that they were talking about the princess needing to rest in a private hospital. She said that there was a suitable palace in the Sarishan area. The maid said that the climate there was warm, the sea was close, and the princess was quickly refreshed. Ray said she was getting better. He asked if it was really necessary for her to leave the palace, but the main character told her brother she wanted to go, so she asked him to leave. The princess told her brother that he wasn't to blame for what happened, so he might as well not cross here for nothing. But Ray said if he hadn't asked her to go out, it wouldn't have happened. The princess sighed and said it was all in the past. Ray asked his sister if she might not go to the palace after all. He said that if she went, he would be alone. But Dorothea thought he wasn't alone. At this point, Ray suggested that his sister go to Epithema together. He said he would help her and asked her to just stay here with him. But the protagonist said she couldn't. Her brother asked her why she decided that. He asked if she was scared because he said it was hard to study there. He said she was smart, and she would do well, and asked her not to give up so easily. The princess thought he was saying that because he didn't know anything. He doesn't know how hard she studied to get there, until Karnan forbade her to enroll there. But Dorothea decided it didn't matter because that idiot wouldn't understand. The protagonist said that she had already decided that she would go for treatment and asked to stop talking about it. She said she was tired and asked her brother to leave. After Ray left, the maid told the princess that he was worried about her. The main character thought she knew it. She thought Ray was good and she was bad. That's the way it's always been. That's why she needs to get away soon. A few days later, Dorothea thought that at times like this she was grateful to Karnan for his indifference. She had never imagined that she would be going for treatment so soon. The princess thought it was a good thing her brother wasn't allowed to go with her. At that moment, Ray met the main character and said he heard she was going to a holiday home. The main character was upset because she didn't want to date him now. She asked why he was suddenly, and Ray explained that she was actually here to give her something. He said he was glad he wasn't late. At this point, the guy handed the princess some candy and said it was a trinket. He said he brought them because he thought she'd get carsick on the road. He asked her if she liked the candy. The main character couldn't believe it was true for her. She said she liked them. Afterwards, the princess took the candy and thanked the guy for caring. And Ray said he couldn't believe she was leaving so suddenly and so far away, and that he wouldn't be able to visit her. He said it was sad, and Ray smiled and said that he hoped Dorothea would be able to improve her health and come back soon. The princess had never felt anything like this in her past life, but at that moment she thought she shouldn't think about it. Then Dorothea turned round and said she had to go. Lastly, Ray suggested that Dorothea get together again later. In the carriage, the princess calmed herself, but she couldn't do that because she realized Ray was thinking about her. The protagonist arrived at the palace. She was surprised at how easy it was to breathe there after the palace, where Ray was killed and Ray died. The protagonist realized that if she thought about it, she'd only have bad memories of that place. She thought it was very nice here because nothing reminded her of her past life. She thought she could start again. At that moment, the maid turned to Dorothea and said that she had asked her to wait for her. She said that Dorothea might be lost. The maid's name is Clara, and she is a maid at the Starry Palace. Clara said that the main character was sure to wait for her next time. Dorothea thought Clara thought she had been sent to this corner of paradise to look after a sick noblewoman or even an empress. Dorothea thought the girl's interest was fleeting, for she turned out to be a pretty princess. At that moment, Clara told the princess that she wanted to introduce someone to her. She said he would accompany her. At that moment, a man appeared in front of the protagonist. His name is Stefan Greenwall. Dorothea remembered how in her previous life she had stood over Stefan and asked him if he didn't answer, even when the empress greeted him. She said he was still as arrogant as ever. The future greatest knight in the empire. Dorothea said it was a shame because she really wanted to fight him someday. She said it wouldn't hurt to give a sensible answer at a time like this. In a past life, he became the head of the Order of Light, after which he died at the hands of the protagonist. Dorothea thought that if he was about 18 now, he had just entered the Order service and had not yet made himself known. She didn't realize that he had really come to distinguish his skills and take a higher position. At that moment, the protagonist reached out to the man's hand for a handshake. She asked him to take care of her. Clara didn't hesitate to say that the princess greeted him very well, but in that moment she realized what the protagonist had done. At that moment, Stefan high-fived the princess. Dorothea didn't understand who told him to do that. She thought the boy was arrogant in front of the princess. The protagonist thought that just as in their last meeting, if she continued to live by the promise of being good, nothing would come of it. She realized that to achieve her goal, she had to break it down into small tasks. But she didn't know how to live a good life. At that moment, the maid approached the protagonist and offered her a snack. Dorothea asked Clara what she needed to do to live a good life. The maid said that to be good, you have to obey your parents, but that's not what the princess asked. At this point, the maid read about Dorothea writing a list of plans for the good life and started laughing. The princess covered the sheet with her hands and asked why she was laughing. Clara told the girl she was too cute to be nice, but Dorothea thought it didn't suit her. The maid asked her why she was writing it. The protagonist replied that she was just writing it, but she realized that of course she was going to live happily ever after. At this point, the maid asked Nastya how about massaging her father 10 times. Clara asked what about smiling 10 times every day. She said that they say that if you smile a lot, you will have good luck. At this point, the protagonist thought it wasn't that she didn't like smiling. There was just no reason for it. Dorothea thought that if you imagine a good man, he must have a smile on his face. She realized that Clara's words made sense. The protagonist smiled and asked if it was really like this. But at that moment, she realized that when she tried to smile, her lips would cramp up. At this point, the princess began to chase away the maid and the knight, saying she needed some time to think. The protagonist thought that for starters, a kind smile once a day. Secondly, not to covet other people's things. She realized that the throne belongs to heaven and Andean Ray Julia. Third, to save 1 million people. The protagonist thought it would be a good idea to save a person. The princess didn't even know how many people had died because of her in her past life. She thought not only of those she had killed with her own hands, but also of those whose lives had been taken by the wars she had started. Horrible working conditions, disease, starvation. In all, she killed 500,000 people. People who might have survived if Ray had become emperor died because of her. So as atonement, she will try to save twice as many people. In addition, thank someone 3 times a week, donating over 1 million forms every month. The protagonist thought that would be enough for a successful life. Afterwards, she went out on the balcony to look at the sea and thought she was very tired. Afterwards, she looked out the door and called for the maid and the knight. She said she wanted to go to the beach. After a while, the protagonist was walking along the beach with Stefan. Princess realized that she had said she wanted to go to the beach, but she didn't expect Stefan to go with her. She's glad he doesn't interfere in any way or speak first. Was very calm, and she finally felt a sense of privacy. At that moment, she noticed an unknown person on the beach. The protagonist didn't realize who it was. She didn't know if there were any other holiday homes nearby besides the Star Palace. At that moment, the protagonist saw the guy's face and thought it was Ethan Bronte, Empress Nastia Milaner's closest neighbor, the most handsome man she had ever known, and the most dangerous. In noble circles, he was also called the Golden-Voiced Angel, and everyone, men and women alike, wished to speak a word to him. So splendid was he. There wasn't a single person who didn't side with Aiden, a loyal servant willing to act for Nastia alone. He gave her everything she loved and also helped her kill Ria. He told the protagonist that Julia was dead. He killed everyone she hated for her. He understood the protagonist's feelings. She thought she'd only found a loyal servant. In a past life, Aiden had asked Nastia why she kept such an arrogant heathen around. He said that if it weren't for Andare, he would have trained with her. He said he would treat her with great affection. Eventually, the protagonist realized that she had made the wrong choice only to face death. Then, when she found to the place of her execution, many people recognized Aiden as innocent. They called him a counselor, trying his best to protect the country while under the rule of a tyrant. He, like a snake, was able to get amnesty with his tongue, and Dorothea went up on the scaffold, bearing her sins too. Dorothea remembered that they also said that he would become emperor after her death, so she should definitely stay away from him in this life. At this point, the protagonist looked at Aiden and surrendered to the question of whether he could really cry like that. He was nothing like the Aiden she knew. Dorothea wondered what if he didn't step into the path of evil. What if he could live a happy life like her? The heroine thought she might be angry with Aiden, but she didn't know if there was any way to live a new life. At this point, walked up to the guy and said hello to him. Aiden stood up abruptly and the protagonist asked what he would do. Aiden started to pull away and the protagonist didn't understand why he looked so scared. But at that moment, he turned around and started to run away and Dorothea asked him to stop. She thought she had been wrong to talk to him like that and should have just left him to cry, but she didn't understand why he was crying alone. He was the bastard son of the Duke of Bronte. Dorothea didn't understand if that was why he was crying. The Duke took his family after his birth, so he could not enter the epistemium until he was of age. He had no right to show his face in high society, if he was always going to be hidden just because he was born out of wedlock. This is the moment the protagonist said she was tired and it was time to go back. She thought Aiden was in the same situation as her. As soon as the rumors spread that the capital's princess had arrived, all the famous families to get in touch with her started sending letters with offers of a visit. So Dorothea was only going to say hello to them and call it a day. But the women praised the protagonist as much as they could. A woman said that they say the main character is sick and that's why she's so thin. The woman then offered to taste the dessert, but Dorothea thanked her for her attention and said she could eat on her own. She realized that they seemed to be treating her like a child. Dorothea thought it was very tiring. She felt like she was surrounded by 100 rays. The first woman said that at that age, Dorothea can't even play outside enough, and the second woman offered to give her medication. But Dorothea refused and said she was fine. She said it wasn't bad enough to take medication. One of the women said that even their serious princess was still a child, and apparently she didn't like the bitter medicine. In a moment, Dorothea asked her helpers to get her out of here. At that moment, a woman told the protagonist that she wanted to invite her to visit them one day. That is, she asked if Dorothea would mind. This woman is the Duchess of Bronte. She smiled and said there was no way she was going to offer her the bitter medicine. Dorothea thought he'd probably have Aiden there. The protagonist said that if she invited her, she would accept with great gratitude. Dorothea thought she could add to her wish list of a prosperous life by joining Aiden's righteous path. The next day, Clara told the princess that everyone really liked her so much that they were going crazy with joy. But the protagonist said that it was because she was a princess that they wanted to make useful connections. But the maid asked if they'd be so pleased with her just because of the connections. She said that whatever the protagonist did, they looked at her with great love in their eyes. Clara said it all comes from their tender feelings for her. Dorothea thought she had never asked her lover for something like this, because she was afraid that if she did, Enray would hate her, for she had always been weak before love. The princess thought that she was not fit to love or be loved. She didn't realize that she could live a good life, even though she didn't really know how to love. After the advert, the heroine came to visit the Duke. She turned him in and said they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The Duke saluted Dorothea and said that she had traveled a very long way to see them, and enclosed to walk with him. Afterwards, they came to a table full of food, but when the princess looked, she didn't see Aiden. The Duke said he should have come last time too, and apologized for greeting her so late. He asked if everything was all right in her new place. At this point, the protagonist told the Duke that she had heard they had a son. The Duke and Duchess laughed and asked if she knew their son Jordan. The Duke said he was now studying at Epistemia. He asked if the young crown prince had also told her about him. Dorothea lowered her eyes and said she wasn't talking about him. She said she had just seen the son of the Bronte family some time ago. She said she was talking about Aiden. The main character said she'd like to meet him now. Duke asked, looking like she had met him before. The main character said she met him while walking on the beach. She asked if Aiden was gone now too. In a moment, the Duchess whispered something to the Duke. Then they wallpapered smiles, and the Duke told Dorothea that she seemed to be interested in their son Aiden. The princess realized that it looked like they had decided that she had fallen in love with him. The Duke said that Aiden was not feeling well tonight, so he was unable to attend the dinner. Afterwards, he apologized for the misunderstanding. The protagonist told the Duke that she thought they could be friends. She asked if they could meet. Duke said they'd have no problem taking her to his place after the meal. He said Aiden would be happy to see her, too. After a while, the protagonist was brought to the guy. Then the maid told him that Princess Dorothea had come to him with a connection there. The main character asked the guy if he was Aiden Bronto, right? Aiden bowed and said he was. But he said it was nice to meet you. He said he was honored to meet her. He said it was a great joy that she, the princess, wanted to meet him. The maid looked very happy and said she would go. She told the children that they could call her if they needed her. Afterwards, the protagonist asked Stefan to go outside while she played with Aiden. Sometime later, Aiden asked Nastia what had brought her to him. He said that there seemed to be nothing for her to do here alone. The princess realized that the boy was pretending not to know her. She thought that he probably just didn't want to mention what had happened on the beach. The protagonist told the guy that she was now resting in a castle not far from here. Aiden asked if it might not be better to leave it than to wander outside. But Dorothea said it was the opposite. She said it was too stuffy to stay indoors all the time. At this point, Aiden noticed that the main character was very thin. The princess told him that everything is fine now, so she's back to her old weight. She said she also liked living here. Aiden said that even though the garden wasn't big, he hoped she would like it too. The protagonist did not understand whether the guy was sincerely kind to her or hiding his feelings. She could not understand it at all. At that moment, Dorothea thought she understood. She thought that if she stared at him, he might waggle an eyebrow. At that point, Aiden asked if there was something on his face, and Dorothea said there was. She recalled that Aiden had a descriptive habit that showed up when he was lying or pretending. She thought she was about to realize whether Aiden was sincere or not. The princess told the guy that he had beauty on his face. At this moment, Aiden became embarrassed and began to cover his face with his hand. The protagonist thought it looked like they didn't know he was actually handsome yet, and she thought that the Aiden she'd become before, on the contrary, would start acting defiant. She thought that's what young Aiden was like. Aiden said the main character is the most beautiful he's met so far. Dorothea thought he was a serpent, seducing people with sweet talk. She didn't know if those words were true. At this point, the guy revealed that he never really had any friends. He said that his older brother didn't like it when he went outside. He said something, if it doesn't come out, you don't hear anything good. But at that moment, he shut his mouth, realizing what he'd said. But he said that anyway, that the protagonist came to him. Dorothea thought she'd always fallen for his sweet talk before, but she thought that was why it was dangerous to date Aiden. At this point, the protagonist wondered if she would be his friend. She said that if he had time, have him come to Anastasis' castle. The protagonist can't be. Aiden can live a life. Aiden asked if he could really do it, and the princess said of course. After that, the guy stood up and kissed the main character on the cheek. It really surprised her, and she didn't realize what it had just been. The main character didn't understand how he dared to kiss the princess on the cheek. She thought that a grown-up Aiden would never do anything like that. But she thought that maybe it was her clinging too much to her that she knew before. At that moment, Dorothea wondered how many times she'd heard Aiden say thank you today. She didn't know if it was worth counting on her wish list. Chances are it's not sincere. At this time in the castle, Clara called out to Stefan. Then he menacingly began to approach her, which frightened her very much. Afterwards, the maid told the knight that the princess's birthday was coming up and asked if they should prepare something for her. Stefan thought about it and didn't say anything, which frightened Clara so much. She thought it was a mistake to bring it up. This moment, Stefan and the maid asked if he would cook something. Stefan also nodded in response. After that, the maid was very happy. She said that she had been thinking about what to give the princess for a long time. She said that whatever she gives her, she never responds. The maid said there had been no particular reaction to any gifts so far, and she is not interested in the dresses or jewelry that the other ladies are so fond of. The maid said that she seems to like books at least. At this point, the maid thought she had thought of something and told the knight what she would say in the ear. Afterwards, she asked how it was for him. But Stefan reacted strangely to it. The maid said she knew the surprise party would be more important than the gift itself. Stefan said the princess was only 9 years old, but Clara said that Prince Raymond liked the same thing when he was 10. So the princess should like it too. Afterwards, Clara said to hurry up and go buy up a whole head, but Stefan just wondered if everything would be all right. A while later, Clara wished the protagonist a happy birthday. The main character was surprised at how much there was on the table and didn't realize if the maid had taken care of it on purpose. At that moment, Clara said that the weather was very nice today and suggested going to the beach nearby. She said that the weather was perfect to go for a walk outside. At that moment, the princess thought she hadn't seen Stefan since this morning. She didn't understand what they were up to. After being outside, the protagonist thought that today is really good weather for a walk. It's also perfect for her birthday. Clara noticed the seashell and told the princess that it was beautiful, but the protagonist thought it sounded very far-fetched. She didn't understand what was so special about this shell. At this point, the protagonist thought Clara had buried the gift right under the sink. But when Dorothea picked it up, it was empty. She didn't understand why Clara had told her to look at the sink. After the protagonist started going through all the sinks looking for a gift, but there was nothing at all. But when the protagonist turned round to look at the maid, she was gone. After the protagonist noticed someone walking towards her and thought it was Clara. But instead of a maid, she saw Stefan dressed in a lion costume. Stefan walked up to her and made a sound like a lion's roar. Afterwards, he said he was the brave hero, Leo the lion. The protagonist realized that Leo was the protagonist of the book whose cover she was using as a disguise. Dorothea wanted to ask them to stop right now, but first she decided to play along a little. It's her good deed today because she's a good person. At that moment, Stefan growled again, and the protagonist thought that maybe she should drop everything. But she realized that Stefan was doing it for his own well-being. Afterwards, Dorothea gave him all the shells she had collected, for she decided to play along a little. Afterwards, the protagonist told Stefan to put them in his pocket. Of course, she was surprised to see a pocket here, because he is not a kangaroo. Only Clara sews pockets in the most unexpected places, and the reason these two are up to something like this? At this point, the protagonist asked Stefan he didn't happen to come here because of her birthday. But afterwards, he got down on one knee and wished her a happy birthday. Although Dorothea was even a little ashamed, she thanked him. She realized how it felt when someone cared about you. Stefan took the protagonist in his arms. The princess thought she couldn't believe that the day had come when Stefan would take her in his arms. After all, he was a knight on the Rhea side. In the past, she'd laughed at Stefan for choosing a bloody death. She'd underestimated Ray, who wasn't part of the nobility, who'd come from a mercenary background. But now he seemed different. A knight offering great endeavors to keep silent and go his own way. Though his origins stand in his way, he has no doubts. The protagonist thought that the fate of having to forge her own path on her own was somewhat like hers, for she was not born heir to the throne. But unlike her, broken on his way, he invariably found to the end. At that moment, the princess said, "Leave it to him that he was a beautiful, brave man." But Stefan remained silent, and the protagonist thought that those words were too unexpected. But that's when Stefan said he wasn't a human, he was a lion. Afterwards, the princess laughed and apologized to him. Afterwards, it started to rain. Stefan began to run quickly towards the palace with the protagonist in his arms. At that moment, a maid came running in with an umbrella. Dorothea offered Stefan to go inside, but he refused and left in silence. The princess realized that he didn't seem to want to take off the lion costume in front of her. The princess entered the room, she saw the letter and asked the maid what it was. Clara said that the letter came from the capital and that Ray had sent it. Clara asked if the protagonist was going to open it, but Dorothea said she would open it later. After the room, Stefan walked in. Clara told him that the princess seemed to believe them. Dorothea saw that the corners of Stefan's lips turned upwards in an unusual way. She thought it was probably because he thought they'd fooled her. Afterwards, the princess asked Stefan where he'd been. The maid said he'd gone to practice. The main character thought that if she fell for such a lie, she would be a complete fool. At that moment, Dorothea told him that today on the beach, she had met the lion hero Leo. However, she asked the knight if he would give her anything for her birthday. She asked if he hadn't prepared anything for her as a present. Stefan wanted to ask for Clara's help, but she withdrew so quickly. Dorothea thought that she was already pretending to be a little girl on Jana. She couldn't just let them all down. Stefan knelt down in front of Dorothea and said he would bring it later, but the princess said her birthday would go later. But she said there was a gift she wanted from him. The main character E said she wanted to study fencing. She said that she was very weak and didn't want to be a Slovak. The princess said that back then, when the evil uncles were dragging her too, she could not defend herself. And today on the shore, what if it had turned out to be a villain instead of a hero? The main character and didn't do it. Worried that if she learned how to wield the ball and got stronger, she'd start wanting more. But then she realized everything. Good people should be just as strong, so she asked to be taught how to wield a sword. The protagonist thought that it's not the sword that determines whether a person is good or evil. A few months later, the protagonist was training. She thought it was much better, so light. Dorothea wondered when Stefan would finally give her a real sword. She didn't understand if he was worried about her getting hurt, or jealous that her abilities were growing like a quiver. At that moment, someone started to approach the princess from behind and she thought it was Stefan. But when she pointed her sword at him, she saw it was Aiden. She apologized to him and said she thought it was Stefan. At this point, Aiden said that her skills were getting better and better every day. But the princess said not enough yet. But the boy said he thought she was great. He said he didn't have any fencing talent himself. The princess thought that was right, for she had never seen Aiden pick up a sword, for he had many supporters who gladly picked up a sword in his place. Aiden said he was very pleased that she looked much healthier now than before. The princess said that she had come on holiday to improve her health. She said she was too sweaty now, but Aiden said it was all right, because there was the smell of grass and the wind, so it was all right. At that moment, the protagonist noticed the racers who were watching them from behind the bushes. One of the maids said that for some reason she felt as if two angels were talking. The princess realized that she had thought so. What was the noise, and they were watching them? At that moment, she asked Aiden why he had come. The boy said that she had told him to come if he was bored. He said that last time he showed her the ducal manor, said that now the protagonist showed him her castle. Dorothea thought her hands must be very sticky now. She said she had to go wash up. Aiden asked if they would start the tour in the bathroom. The princess was very surprised at these words and asked what. The guy said she should have a face and hands, and the protagonist didn't realize why she was only thinking. But at that moment she realized that she didn't have to go to the bathroom at all. She realized that she could just ask for water to wash her face. But Aiden said he was joking. He said he would be waiting for her in the guest room and she could get ready and go out in peace. The protagonist realized that Aiden was definitely not an easy opponent. After Dorothea got ready, she showed the boy her room. Aiden said her room was very tidy. The princess thought that before her rebirth, her room had been quite luxurious. She could only rest when she had everything she wanted. So in her room, she collected everything she could. Though she tried to fill the emptiness inside with such things as well, she realized that they were all useless. The protagonist thought it was all completely useless. No matter how much she thought about it, she seemed pathetic to herself. At that moment, Aiden told the protagonist that he had brought her a present. Then he took out the necklace and said that she had invited him, and he should come empty-handed. The protagonist thought it was obvious that it was an expensive piece of writing. She asked where he got it from. Aiden asked him where he was from. He said he was from the Bronte family after all. At this point, the protagonist said it was too good a thing for her to take as a gift. She said she would only accept his sincerity. Aiden asked if she didn't like pendants. He asked if she didn't like them, but the main character said they'd only just met, and it's better to give something like this to people near and dear to them. Aiden said he thought they were nearest and dearest, but he said he seemed overly excited that someone had come to him first. He apologized if he'd burdened the main character. Dorothea thought that she had said he was good at playing on people's feelings. At this point, the protagonist said she would go back to training and asked if Aiden would go, and he agreed. But at that moment, the boy noticed the letters that were lying on Nastia's table and asked what they were. He said that they seemed to be from the imperial palace. But the princess said it was nothing important. She thought it was obvious what was in there, just whining about how hard it is to study an epistemics when you're a crown prince. She thought that if she had one, she wouldn't pass up a chance like this. But the princess realized that she had to stop thinking about such things, both for Ray's sake and her own. It's better this way. That's when the protagonist offered to go already. But at that moment, Aiden noticed Theon's handkerchief and said he thought it didn't come from the palace. The main character threw the handkerchief in the nightstand and said it was just a gift and asked me to ignore it. Dorothea thought it wasn't that it was a gift, she just didn't return it. Aiden said that then, next time he would give her a handkerchief too. He asked their relationship to drink enough for him to give her a handkerchief. The protagonist and said that it was, and then he told Dorothea to show him other places, like her wardrobe or something, after a while. The protagonist didn't realize what the atmosphere was today. She didn't understand why it was so tense. That's when the maid asked the princess if she should return to the imperial palace. The maid told her that there's a terrible contagious disease spreading around right now. She said that it was influenza, but it seemed to be very severe. She said that they say many people are even dying of pneumonia. The protagonist asked, and it can't be cured, yes. The maid said it could be cured, of course, but it is still contagious. She said that the medicine to cure the disease is very expensive for ordinary people. The princess didn't understand and how she wouldn't want to leave this place. At this point, the protagonist realized that this was a great way to expand her wish list. The protagonist told the maid that if there was a cure, it was no problem. She said that with medicine and healers, she could help. The main character says she's a princess and she can help with that. She realizes that although she lacks kindness, she has plenty of money, so she could do something about it. The princess realizes that the power of money is greater than she thought. The princess's name and money solved all the difficulties, and after less than half a month, the disease began to wane, and the village, which had known of the infection, regained its vitality. Clara told Dorothea it was all thanks to her. She said that thanks to her, all the sick people of the town got well. She said she had a very kind soul, and praised her thoughts. Clara said that even her pride was swelling, and she needed everyone to know about the nobility of their princess. The main character didn't know if it was a good deed to spend the money she already had a lot of, and she didn't know if she had done a good deed. That moment ran from the onion and said that someone had left a potato on the creator's doorstep as a thank you. Aiden told Dorothea that maybe that's how she was paid to help, but he said she was the one who beat the infection. But Dorothea said it couldn't be. Aiden said it looked like people wanted to repay her for her kindness. He said it wasn't just him but everyone she had helped. He said they would remember her as a good person. At that moment, the princess realized that until now she could not feel that she had done something good. But someone expresses gratitude in this way. At this point, the protagonist told the maid that she would let the passing potatoes be planted in the garden, and the rest cooked for dinner tonight. At that moment, the protagonist asked Aiden how about having dinner with her tonight, and the guy agreed. 3 years later, the main character fought Stefan. She thought she used to be a head taller than him, and now she not only can't attack properly, she can't even do that cheeky stance. Dorothea didn't understand why her body couldn't do what she wanted it to do. At that moment, a maid started shouting from the castle. She told the princess that she had had enough exercise and it was her right to return. The main character saw Stefan open up and attacked him. She thought she was going to win this game, but at that moment, Stefan simply stopped her sword with his hand. The main character was upset and asked who was grabbing the ball with her bare hand. She said that now he was humiliating her, showing her that she was weak. But at that moment, Stefan started to leave and Dorothea told him she wasn't done yet. At the same time, Ray stood at the window and was sad because for 3 years he had not received a single reply from the protagonist. But at that moment, Ray came up to him and told him not to worry. He said the princess is definitely reading all the letters. He said she must be very busy. And Ray thought that he had said that they would definitely meet again. At this point, Ray told his friend that if Epistemia didn't have such strict rules, he'd go to her right now. But Ray told him that they had been here for quite some time, so they should be allowed to leave. And Ray asked how about going to see her. Was happy and said it had been so long since they had seen each other, so he was sure his sister would be pleased. The main character asked Stefan when she would finally be able to fight with a real sword, but he remained silent. But at that moment, Clara shouted at them and said that she had been calling them for a long time, and they had only come now. She said that lunchtime was long gone and asked how long it would be. At that moment, Clara turned to Stefan and said that she had asked him not to grab the notes with his bare hands. She told him to look at these because his hands were all covered in skid marks. Clara said she'd get them out later. Afterwards, the maid escorted the protagonist to the bathroom. In the bath, the maid told the princess that she was very upset with her. She said that she had so much to do today and she still hadn't come back. The protagonist apologized and said that she was so sure that she hadn't heard. The main character asked the maid if the monthly gratitude had arrived. Clara said that this time they had brought them Misha's wilted chicory. She said that it had been over 2 years since the princess had helped them cope with the illness, and they were still tirelessly thankful. Dorothea thought it was time it stopped already, but she didn't realize who was bringing it. At this point, the protagonist noticed a red-haired guy and thought it was him doing it, but afterwards he quickly ran away. The protagonist wished she could at least invite him to eat with her. She thought that maybe she should catch him when he brought the sack again. That's when the maid said she couldn't eat something like that. She explained that if all the unworthy leaves were removed, there would be only bare trunks left. But the heroine told the maid that after all, they had put their soul into it. But Clara said that still the princess should eat better and wear even better clothes. Dorothea said that it's thanks to them that the Reneur has a special mission every month. She said that means today they have a special chicory dish. After her bath, the maid brought the princess a letter from the capital. She said that this time Ray had sent 2 letters at once. The protagonist took them thinking she wasn't reading them anyway. She asked, but one of them wasn't for her. She said the second one was for Stephen and it came from the rector's order. When left, he read the letter. The maid along with the protagonist looked at him. Clara told the princess that this was the first time a letter had come for Stefan. She said she didn't realize the look on his face. After the protagonist asked the charter what the letter was about, and he said it was about the knight's promotion exam. The princess realizes that the promotion exam means that Stefan has the opportunity to become a knight of the highest class. It also means he can leave here. Clara told Stefan that means it's good news for him. Dorothea said it was really great news. She said it's a chance that comes along once every few years, and not everyone gets it. After the protagonist asked Ustan if she could look at the letter said that a promotion exam would be held amongst the Ray Knights, who fulfill the requirements of the Radiant Order. The date of the exam had been set for the fast, so in order to arrive on time, they would have to leave this week. Also, no one is coming to replace him. This means that the Imperial Palace will no longer provide the princess with a personal knight for protection. The protagonist told the maid not to worry because it's a pretty peaceful place. She said that she had already learnt Stefan's swordsmanship, so she would be able to defend herself. The heroine thought it was amazing that Karnan had been showing her support all this time. After racing, said the princess that she would go see how the food was, and she would let her rest. As the maid left, told Stefan that she was sure he'd go for the exam. She said that in all the time he's been serving her, There hasn't been anything outstanding. Also, he couldn't spend time with other individuals, so she was worried that she wouldn't be able to go for a promotion, so she's glad she went out like that. The protagonist told Safin that he would be the one to take the high ground. She said that perhaps he would not protect the princess, but the crown prince himself. Dorothea told Stefan that they had all been together for a short time, so she would like to organize a send-off for him. She said that tomorrow was too soon, and it might be better to leave the day after tomorrow. Thought they were really getting along well with that rude knight all this time. The protagonist and said it was her last request and asked if he would honor it. He said that she thought she and he were getting just a little closer. The protagonist and asked if he could stay just a little longer. Took the main character by the lips and told her that he is her personal knight and her protection is his mission and duty. But Dorothea said it was better to go higher than just being here. She didn't understand why she was surrounded by fools. She didn't understand why they refused to take advantage and act at a loss. The princess told him that if he did that, people around him would call him a fool. He asked why he was giving up a good thing in favor of something worse, but he smiled and said he was just doing a job he liked. Dorothea thought that he had behaved that way before she was reborn. Even when the defeat was obvious, he still tried to protect him, even though Raymond had obviously lost. The protagonist and thought Stefan was always human, making stupid choices. The protagonist hugged her boyfriend and thought that even if everyone pointed their fingers at her and called her a gist coy, it couldn't be helped. She thought it looked like she was bad from the get-go. After a while, the protagonist went out on the street in the hope of helping people in difficulty, but she didn't realize why there was so much here. At this point, the protagonist saw people and wanted to approach them, but Stefan took her in his arms. The protagonist didn't realize if he still thought she was small. Together where people were crowded, the protagonist read the announcements. It said that this year there was a tournament for amateur swordsmen. You can register from today until the day after tomorrow at the registration point on the square. The competition is held in the form of it and is divided by age categories. At which point Dorothea told Stefan that it was a swordsman competition and suggested he go register. After the main character along with Stefan walked into the tent and said she wanted to sign up for tonics, but the man looked at her and said he thought her companion didn't look like an amateur. At this point, he thought it was only Dorothea who came to register and said she needed to eat more porridge to grow up to begin with. But the protagonist said she's not that age anymore. She said the rules are written that any older 10-year-old can participate. The man asked her what this brazen bickering was all about. He asked her if it was something her daddy taught her. Man, the princess got mad and asked what he just said. The main character didn't think that she wanted a prosperous life, but she couldn't stand it any longer. This was the moment Stefan stuck the table. He told the man to follow the rules. After the main character and Stefan went outside and the princess said that thanks to him, she was able to sign up. She said they wouldn't go back now. But at that moment, the protagonist heard some boy shouting at the other one. He asked if he wasn't listening to him at all. The second boy said he did, and the first brother. The first said he wasn't his brother. He said he saw him calling him young master. Dorothea thought maybe she should do something kind before she went home. But at that moment, the second boy fell down and everything in his hands fell out. The first boy asked him what he was doing. He asked him if there was anything he could do. At that moment, the protagonist noticed that such a guy was Aiden. His brother slapped him on the cheek and said he was going to give it all to his mother, and he broke it all. He told him to put it away now. But when Aiden tried to pick up the pieces, he cut his finger. His brother took a swing at him and asked him what he was faking it for. He said that Aiden was not only useless, but hopeless. But at that moment, the princess stood in front of Aiden and told the guy to stop. The protagonists pulled Aiden's hand and said that this was her good deed for the day. Aiden's brother asked Nastia if she even knew who he was, but the protagonist asked if he knew who she was. Ed's brother asked Nastia why he would know someone like her, but the protagonist said that not knowing doesn't exempt you from responsibility. But she said she was kind this time, so she wouldn't do anything. She said if a guy wants to live a long time, he should have a proper video. After the princess, she grabbed Aiden's hand and began to lead the way. Aiden was surprised. He didn't realize that the princess was worried about him. At this point, the main character went up to Stefan and said that thanks to him, they were able to solve everything and thanked him. After 11, I went over and told him his cheek was swollen. The guy said it was fine and that it happens to him a lot. The protagonist thought that someone like him could easily get out of this situation, and he's just lukewarm. The protagonist didn't realize if it was because he was so young. Aiden said that her master must hate him because he was born on the side. Dorothea thought that meant this guy was Jonathan Bronto. At this point, Aiden asked the princess if she would mind if he stayed with her until the young lord stopped being angry. Dorothea agreed and told him to stay at their castle for a while. When the princess returned to the castle, she met Theon. He said he missed her so much. After the main character, I asked my brother why he was here. He said he was on holiday at Epistemia, so he asked him to leave. At that moment, Ray came up to them and told the princess that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. Dorothea was surprised to see the guy and said his name, and Ray said it was a relief that she still remembered him. The princess asked her brother what they were doing here, and he said he'd offered to go together. That Ray had also spent time in this castle. But at that moment, Dorothea grabbed Rhea and started to walk off somewhere with him. The protagonist brought him to her room and asked him why he had come. Hay said he missed you a lot, but I didn't ask him why he missed you. He said it wasn't that. But Dorothea asked why he brought Theon with him. The main characters didn't want to forget everything, so they wouldn't hesitate anymore. But she didn't understand why she'd come here to torture her. I mean, what was the point of her running away then? At that moment, Ray asked the main character if she knew Theon. He said that he wanted to spend some time together, and Andy and Ray was also happy to agree. But the protagonist and asked his brother thought about her feelings and asked her permission. He asked her if he'd ever thought about her. She said he wanted to please her, so he came unexpectedly to surprise her. But at that moment, the princess shouted to him that this was not a surprise but a disaster. She told them to leave now. At this point, Ray started crying and told the main character that she wasn't even answering, and he was worried that she was lonely here. The main character and didn't understand why he cried, and why he always turns her into a villain, to people to the point of tears. This moment, Dorothea thought that if she stayed here, she would get more angry. But when she wanted to go out, she met Theon, and Ray told her she looked like she wasn't feeling well. But at that moment, the protagonist abruptly ran away. She wanted Ray to see only the best side of her, but she didn't understand why it wasn't working. Well, at this point, Ray grabbed her and asked her to stop. Dorothea didn't understand why now. She had waited so long for Theona to take her hand. She wanted to turn around, but she couldn't, because she thought she was totally worthy of it. Well, this is the moment Andy and Ray asked her to give him a little time. At this point, the guy apologized for such an unexpected visit. He said that he should have sent someone to break the news of his arrival, but they decided to go here spontaneously. And Ray said that the princess must be very unhappy that he, not even a member of the imperial family, had come here. But Dorothea thought that wasn't true. And Ray said he was here because he wanted to see her. He said he was really worried then after he walked her out. And Ray said that's why he told her he wanted to go with the prince. He asked the protagonist if she might dislike him, but Dorothea said it wasn't. And Ray said it was a big relief, but he asked the princess why he was forever looking at him with that expression on his face. Dorothea didn't understand what was wrong with her face. She thought it looked like it wasn't particularly pretty. At that moment, and Ray took a knee and told the princess that he wanted them to get along. The moment the main characters didn't think she wanted them to sweat so much. Those were words she'd said to him hundreds of times. But at that moment, Aiden came over and told the protagonist that his cheek was very sore. He asked if she had any medicine. At this point, the protagonist started to leave with Aiden and told Theon her that she had completely forgotten about the guest she herself had brought. She said she would go and not see him afterwards. Afterwards, Dorothea went into the room with Aiden and told him to wait while she got the medicine. The main characters didn't think she was stupid answer. Andy Ray said he wanted to get along with her and she just ran off like that. At this point, Aiden said he didn't need medicine. He said his cheek was just a little swollen. The main character said that he had just asked for medicine. But Aiden said it's fine and he thinks he needs the cure and she needs it. Aiden told the princess that she seemed to be in more pain than he was. He said she seemed to have a fever. The protagonist pulled away from the bathhouse and said she was fine and asked him to ignore her. She didn't realize he couldn't have guessed. But at this point, Aiden said he thought he understood why she had decided to come on holiday here. He asked if she wanted him to cure her of the disease. Aiden told Dorothea he liked her. But Dorothea realized he was lying again. She pushed the guy and told him that she didn't like such jokes. The guy told her that she must be very sick because she doesn't even smile at such jokes. Dorothea asked him if he would leave, but the guy asked what about her. The protagonist said she would stay a little longer. Then Dorothea pulled Aiden back out and said that when he wanted to go back to the Duke's house, let him tell Clara and she would get the carriage ready. When Aiden came out, he met Theon and he asked him who he was. Aiden introduced himself and said he was from the Duke of Bronte's family. He said his family owned the land. And Ray asked him if the guy had applied the medicine, and Aiden said of course he had, said she carried it personally so it didn't hurt anymore. He asked, however, only he had to introduce himself. After Ray introduced himself, Aiden looked at him admiringly and said he was honored to meet him. Ray wanted to go into the room where the main character was sitting, but Aiden stopped him. He said he shouldn't tonight. After the boy explained to Theon that the princess had said she wanted to rest alone. He said that she seemed very tired because she had fencing today, and then walked around the village with him. And Ray asked him if he and the princess were really that close. But Aiden said they're not close at all. He said the big thing between them is carrying medicine if someone gets hurt. He said they also make sure to see each other once or twice a week. At this point, Aiden leaned over and said that it looked like a bolt of extra and he should leave. Dorothea sat staring out the window. She thought she had rehearsed her smile so hard, but it wasn't any better. She didn't realize that she would always react like that to Theon. At that moment, the room got a knock. The protagonists asked who was there. But there was silence, and Dorothea thought that because he didn't say anything, it was Andy Ray. But when the main character opened the door, she saw Stefan there. Asked why he was here. She asked if he had hurt himself or was looking for a keyboard, but Stefan shook his head no. Dorothea asked if he could come in, since she would be staying here for a long time. After Stefan walked in, there was an awkward silence. The princess told Stefan to sit next to her, because the room was already cramped and he made it seem even more cramped. At that moment, Dorothea told Stefan that if he wasn't busy, he might listen to her. At that moment, the heroine told me that she had a nightmare. She said that in the dream she had a man whom she loved madly, but he hated her. So much so that he eventually died in her room. Dorothea said she's been thinking about it for a long time. She said she was born by killing her mother. Dorothea asked if maybe she was born bad, therefore worthy of love, and whatever she does, her destiny is to be a villain. The main character said that's why she was scared. She thought Dorothea was evil and nothing more, that she was evil to the bone. The princess asked Stefan, this is nonsense, really. But at that moment, he put his arms around her. Stefan said the princess was a good girl and the protagonist agreed. She was very grateful to the guy and wanted to apologize for killing him in a previous life. She really wanted to live that life. At this point, Clara was looking for the main character and thought that maybe she was in the room. Knight walked into the room and saw Ray crying. Said it sounded like his sister hated him. He said she called his arrival a disaster. The guy then that he was only worried because the protagonist lived here alone for several years. But he didn't realize whether the country was worried about his younger sister, left alone in a foreign land. He's been waiting for this day since the first day of the holidays. Race told the maids that he looked like a real fool in Nastia's eyes. Clara asked how he could be a fool since he was even studying at Epistemia. She said that it was the best school in the empire, where talents from all over the world gathered. She said that even just getting in means a lot. But Rady was frustrated and said that he still came in 80th out of 100 in these exams. Ray told the maid that it would be nice if the main character would fall in love with him, but he didn't understand what he should do. Clara thought there were 2 letters every month, but the heroine didn't read them either. But she realized there was no way to measure them. At this point, asked the maid if the protagonist would become fond of him if he did something she liked. Asked the maid what the protagonist liked. Told me that the princess loves fencing and has never missed a practice. Said it's great because he's got a ball. The maid said that in a few days there was a competition in the settlement on behalf of the Duke. She asked how she would like to participate. I thought that if he could win, the main character would also recognize him and say he was cool. At that moment, he asked the maid to do everything to get him into the competition. And Ray came into the room at that moment and said that the princess didn't seem to be feeling well. He said he thought he should leave, but the maid said he'd only just arrived today. She said she'd go and see the princess and let the boys stay here. RB was upset and didn't know if everything was okay. And Ray said he shouldn't have come, but Heaven said it was because of him. And Ray wondered if the protagonist was angry that he'd rushed in unannounced. After all, she doesn't even live in the palace and they're not close. At that moment, and Ray noticed his handkerchief that was lying on the nightstand. He didn't understand why he was here. After all, the guy wasn't sure she'd thrown it away. At night, the protagonist stood on the balcony. She didn't realize if it was because Andy Ray was around, but she thought maybe that's why she couldn't sleep. Dorothea looked at the handkerchief and then that she had to return it. At that moment, the main IKEA not accidentally let the handkerchief out of her hands and it flew down. Well, afterwards, I went over and picked it up. The princess didn't understand how she could, since now the guy knew she still kept his handkerchief. But Andy Ray just said it's late at night and she's outside. The protagonist shouted to the guy that she was going to return it. She said that she was pondering how best to return it, and the handkerchief itself returned to its owner. But Andy Ray smiled and told the protagonist that she looks better when she smiles. He asked if she would stay there a little longer. Afterwards, the guy climbed a tree, and Ray thanked the protagonist for not running away. Dorothea thought he was the one who always ran away from her, and now he was thanking her for not running away from her. The princess didn't know what to do because she knew she was about to pay. At this point, the princess asked Theon if he could come up here and they could talk. She was afraid he might fall. The main character pulled the guy's arm and said it wasn't safe. She was afraid he was going to die right now. And Ray grabbed the main character's hand and said he couldn't understand her at all. At this point, and Ray said he'd been wanting to ask her something for some time, to ask the protagonist if she's comfortable with him. She said it's nothing like that. And Ray said that's a big relief. He said if it wasn't about being uncomfortable, fine. He said it felt so good to convince her again. And Ray said there was something he couldn't tell her that day. He said that at the time of her appointment, he was sorry there was nothing he could do. And Ray told the main character that she actually missed her, but he thought she didn't like letters, so he didn't write her anything. He said he was so glad that at least now they could talk, looking into each other's eyes. Shit. The princess didn't realize maybe it was a dream, and Ray, who always eluded her, said he missed her. At this point, she asked him what he was doing in the garden late at night, and Ray said he just likes the night. He said it looks like it's because he's a freedman. He said that Contented often skips out at night, but Dorothea thought she knew he always went to bed late and liked to take a nap in the afternoon. At this point, and Ray told Dorothea that it was time for her to go to bed again. He said it was quite late, and Dorothea agreed. Then he gave her the handkerchief and said that if she needed it, she could keep it with her. The princess asked if she could really keep it. The guy said she could. The main character and thought she had never received a gift from Theon and thanked him. And Ray smiled and said he'd like to go too. And then he said goodnight to the main character. After a while, Dorothea was lying on the bed holding a handkerchief in her hands. But she thought she couldn't be happy. She thought Theon had Julia and he didn't belong to her. But she thought that just on a hunch. If Andy and Ray falls in love with her. The next morning, the maid learned that the princess had also signed up for the swordsmanship competition. Dorothea asked why it was such a surprise, and the maid said she was just worried about hurting herself. The maid realized that this meant that the prince and the prince would be involved in the place, and she realized that she should have told her. Clara thought that she was having a hard time with Stefan, and that if they were to fight, it would be disastrous. But she thought it wouldn't necessarily happen, and hoped that everything would be all right. Honestly, sometime at the competition, the main character met together with his brother, realized his sister wasn't here to cheer him on. The protagonist thought the same thing. At that moment, Dorothea asked the maid if she knew everything, but Clara said she had only found out yesterday. She asked the princess why she had not told her at once that she was involved. Ray asked Theon what to do and he told him he'd be fine. The main character didn't realize maybe she should opt out, but she thought she wasn't going to give up what she wanted just because of one Ray. She thought there was nothing wrong with the day. Dorothea thought it had been a long time since she'd fought Ray. At that moment, Clara asked Nastia if she was worried, but the princess calmly said no. After a while, the rivals showed up. Clara prayed that the protagonist wouldn't fight alongside her brother in the first fight. At this point, Dorothea said she had to fight someone called Alex, which made the maid very happy. She said that she was similar, and they evenly distributed the next round so that the older guys would go through. That's when Aiden saw the main character. I don't know why she came here. He saw that her opponent from the beginning was that guy, but they're almost twice as different physically. At that moment, Aiden approached the Duke. He asked if the distribution could be changed. He said he thought it would be fairer to fight guys with similar physical characteristics. Aiden said it's not fair to those who are very physically different from their opponent. Aiden said that if you do that, people will complain that it's not interesting to watch the obvious results. And he would like as many people as possible to watch the competitions on behalf of the Proto family. The Duke petted Aiden and said he would tell the servant to change the distribution a bit. The guy who was the protagonist's opponent, when he heard that they were changing the distribution, said that his opponent was just scared. He said he would have been a little embarrassed to fight such a small girl. But at this point, Dorothea said she wasn't scared. She said it was just that the organizers had decided to keep him alive a bit longer. He said that of course he was so huge and it would be a shame to lose the first round. Got mad at the main character and said she was a baby. But the princess said that if he wanted to fight, let it be on the tournament field. She said only bad people fight in a place like this. After a while, it was announced that the contestants from each side were coming out. He was surprised that he was the first, and it was exciting for him. At that moment, he saw the main character and waved at her. But the protagonist and just turned around, which upset the guy. He thought if she waved, he might be less nervous. Dorothea looked at her brother and thought that his gaze had remained the same. She thought that even though he acted like a fool, even his gaze changed at important moments. And the protagonist didn't like it either. At this point, the fight began. Ray won the first bout. Then the second bout began, where the main character came out. Aiden was surprised because the protagonist came out with the same opponent, even though he had asked to change the distribution. But I thought she said she came here for her health. Hey, I was scared because I was afraid she'd get hurt. At this point, the guy told Dorothea that he wouldn't even notice if he swatted her. But Dorothea thought it would be better if the balls were real. After that, the fight began, and Dorothea thought she was unaccustomed to it. She thought guys were really slow. After the fight, he praised the protagonist. He said he didn't know she was so good with a sword. He asked how it happened, but Dorothea asked him not to show that they knew each other. Ray agreed and thought it was very difficult, but he thought that his sister must have worked very hard to get to that level. He thought he hadn't even really praised her. At this point, and Ray came over to the edge and said that this could be how he and the princess got lazy in the finals. Said that was true, but he never imagined that he would one day cross swords with his sister. And Andy Ray said he didn't know the princess was so good at fencing. Ray said there was nothing she wasn't capable of. The protagonist and Paradise were climbing smoothly to the finals, and Dorothea was already facing the semifinals. The protagonist's opponent apologized but said you should definitely win. He said he'd win and get the prize. The protagonist thought this guy looked familiar, but she didn't realize where from. That's when she thought it was the same kid who expressed gratitude every month. She didn't understand why he was here now. This moment, the guy attacked the main character and said it looks like she has time to think about something extraneous. The princess thought he might Tahaka, but here's the ability so-so. The main character asked the guy why he was trying so hard for some 10 forms. The guy started yelling at him and said she didn't dare say that. He said they'd be enough to live on for a month. He said you could even sell your life for them. But the protagonist said that there are many ways to make money without even giving up your life. Dorothea said it was a stupid thing to sell your life for a dozen forms. and she said that if there came a time when she had to do it, she'd let the guy find her. At this point, he asked her who she even was. Dorothea said she'd eaten his presents with gusto. She told the boys the potatoes were delicious. Then the main character started to leave, but the guy asked her to wait. Then came the finale everyone had been waiting for. It was announced that the moment everyone had been waiting for was finally here. People did not know who would be the protagonist of today's competition. Asked my sister if she wanted to take first place. The heroine looked angrily at her brother and told him to just try and give in to her. After that, the bout began. Dorothea didn't understand why everyone thought they were winning. She didn't know if she could look so weak. The maid was watching the fight and told Stefan that she didn't know who she should be cheering for right now. She asked Stefan who he thought would win, but he just watched the fight. At that moment, Ray punched the protagonist in the shoulder. She thought she had to pull herself together. But at that moment, Heaven asked if he had hit hard. He apologized afterwards. The princess got angry and yelled that she wasn't hurt, so he needed to focus. The main character thought it was nothing, and it was nothing. How could he do that? Because he hurt the heroine. He couldn't keep competing with Dorothea like that. But that's when the protagonist said that she kind of asked you not to give in. Afterwards, she dropped the sword and started to walk away. Ray went after her and told her to wait. He said if she gave up like that during the fight, they'd be in trouble. But this moment is over the rope. At that moment, a huge wooden beam began to fall on him. Without thinking, the protagonist rushed to save her brother and pushed him away. But unfortunately, she herself was wounded. After a while, the protagonist was treated to a sponge. Race asked her why she ran up. She said that in the worst-case scenario, she could have been one-handed. The princess didn't know why she ran. She said it was better for the princess to get hurt than for the crown prince. She asked who was the right person to save if they were both in mortal danger. But Clara asked how such a thing could be said. She said that of course they wouldn't save her princess. The maid said she knighted her men. Dorothea smiled and said that even if they were just words, she was grateful. At that moment, Ray was crying in his room. He said that what he had come to see was a real disaster. And Ray wanted to reassure him at first. But after he came out, he realized it was better to leave him alone now. But that's when Ray spotted Aiden. Aiden told Theon that he thought he'd leave quickly. And Ray asked him if it wasn't his place to worry about that. But Aiden said he was just thinking about the princess. He said that the day he arrived, he thought she was quite uncomfortable. But Andy Ray told the guy that he seemed to be taking too much interest in the princess's affairs. Aiden says that's right because he's very interested in the princess. He said it was because he liked her. Aiden said he'd heard Theon had a favorite. He asked if it was Julia, didn't he? He said he thought he'd understand his feelings. But Andy Ray said he seems to have fallen near the land of rumor as he and Julia are just friends. At that moment, a maid ran in and told the boys that Nastia's treatment was over. The Duke came to the protagonist and apologized. He said he had done a terrible thing. The Duke didn't understand why she had broken her arm at the tournament under his name. He thought he was lucky she had hurt herself. The protagonist told the Duke that everything was fine. She said that with the help of the Duke's family, she would be able to get treatment. The main character didn't look see Aiden's beard, and thought it looked like he knew who she was now. At this point, the protagonist was told it was time for her to go. Hay wanted to say something to her, but Dorothea walked past. Aiden was upset because he had so much to say. She didn't even look at him. In the carriage, the protagonist wondered why she had saved Ray then. At that moment, he thanked her for saving him today. He apologized for hurting herself because of him. At this point, Rai said that next time you don't have to do that. He said he didn't like that she hurt herself because of him. But he said he just didn't like that she hurt herself. The main character didn't think that because he was so good he couldn't become emperor. She told her brother that he was the one who had to fix it first. Dorothea thought his kindness and love for her, no matter how much she pushed him away, which she didn't have even after being reborn. This is the moment he told his sister that if she was having a hard time or was uncomfortable with something, let her tell him, and he would do it all for her. The protagonist asked if he'd really do it. Ray said of course he would, because it's for her, but said he'd be willing to be her hand instead of the one she broke. The protagonist thought he'd try to do as she told him to do.